the Syrian government collapse. And for more on this, I do want to bring in Hal Kempfer, who is a national security analyst, to talk more about this. Hal, as always, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So, what really struck me, Hal, about everything that has been happening in Syria, we know now that the government has collapsed. President Assad has fled to an undisclosed location. But what really struck me is just how quickly all of this unfolded. There has been a civil war for years now. So what was the difference maker this time around?
Basically, the difference was the collapse of the Syrian army. They started falling back. They weren't really putting up significant fights. And we saw this in Aleppo. It was rather surprising to everyone how quickly the HTS, if you will, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is actually an offshoot of a thing called the al-Nusra Front, which was actually the offshoot of a thing called Al-Qaeda in Syria. They basically they had this very large group. They rolled into Aleppo, the second largest city, and they took it very quickly. And then literally like day by day, they went down to Hama. They took that, then they took Homs. And frankly, I was getting reports that they were on the outskirts of Damascus before I had confirmation that they'd actually taken Homs, which was the third largest city. And it sounds like they just didn't run into any significant opposition. Part of it may be, at some point, it's not quite clear when, but sometime Sunday, Assad fled. And once he fled, the whole purpose, if you will, for the government, the military and everything else basically fell apart. And the leader of HTS basically said, hey, look, if you surrender, we will work with you. And he actually took a page, he took a kind of an inverse page from the American book in Iraq. One of the things we did very badly was that we disbanded the Iraqi government completely. And it turned into utter chaos and anarchy with a lot of looting and everything else, and created a very, very problematic situation for us over there. What they have done, interestingly, is they have said, look, we will work with you. If you turn around, change sides, we will work with the government institutions that are there to maintain some sort of continuity of government services and everything else. And I gotta say, it seems to be, at least so far, we're literally within, I mean, the first day, hours, if you will, it seems to be working for them, that they haven't had a complete collapse like we saw with Iraq, with Baghdad.
And to that point, now that President Assad has fled and the government has collapsed, I think the big question is what happens next. You were mentioning, an example of what not to do, specifically with Iraq. But now the question is, how does one fill the vacuum? Obviously, there are a number of different organizations and groups, I imagine, who would want to take over. But what does happen next? How does one ensure that there isn't chaos and it doesn't descend into that?
Well, the U.S. position is that we're not going to ensure anything with this because we're in a kind of a difficult situation, as is most of the West, as is Israel, as are most of the neighbors around Syria right now, which is you've lost Bashar al-Assad, a despotic dictator who used chemical weapons on his own people. His civil war over the last 14 years has killed over 500,000 Syrians, caused this mass exodus of Syrians, of millions of Syrians have fled Syria for all around the world, but Turkey and the neighboring countries. So he's out. His government's out after 60 years with him and his father being in charge. But who's replaced him? Well, who took Damascus was this offshoot of Al-Qaeda. And so that's got everybody kind of scratching their heads going, what exactly is this thing? And then within, if you actually go into look at the ground, they control part of it. They control Damascus. They control certainly going up to Idlib, where they came from, up to the north. They control large swaths of Syria. However, what we're also seeing is other groups have been moving in. There's a pro-Turkish militia up north that's taken a couple of villages and towns. The Kurdish controlled groups off in the east have been moving forward and taking villages and town and taking key crossroads or checkpoints, if you will, border crossings with Iraq. So they're moving forward. The U.S. has that enclave in the south. We're maintaining our position. It's not quite clear what the situation is because now they have no government to have an agreement with as far as a demilitarized area. And then what really is disturbing is ISIS has also been filling in this gap, this vacuum, if you will, by expanding some of its territorial presence over there. And by the way, I should mention HTS isn't just this offshoot of Al Nusra Front. They brought a bunch of different groups together, and some of these groups have very different agendas. So the question everyone has now is HTS going to consolidate power, or is this just a brief interlude until they break into another full-scale civil war? And that's what nobody's really sure of right now.
And you mentioned two organizations that I think everyone it wants to hear more about. You mentioned Al Qaeda. You also mentioned ISIS. So how do those terrorist organizations play into the potential future of Syria?
Well, it's interesting. The leader of HTS actually came over as to set up Al Qaeda of Syria. He was working with al Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS, who back if you go back to 2014-15. That's the leader of ISIS that swept across big chunks of Syria and down into Iraq, and who we worked with the Iraqi government to push out. And we have a very concerted anti-ISIS program. That's why we have our physical presence in Syria, is going after ISIS. Well, ISIS has now expanded. They're not anywhere close to where they were before. I mean, at one point they controlled more territory than the size of the United Kingdom, to give you an idea of how big they are. But they do have these small enclaves, and it appears that they have gained some territory, basically with the Syrian government forces falling apart, just pulling back and disappearing. They have pushed out. Now, that's going to be a decision for U.S. Central Command. What do we do now? Do we increase our strikes on ISIS? Who would we work with? Probably we have a relationship with the Kurdish forces there, or Kurdish controlled forces there. Probably work with them. And then I should mention there's also some more democratic type forces that want a more secular government that we have worked with quite a bit. And so it's really not clear where this is going to go. It's a fascinating situation on the ground. ISIS is something nobody really wants to see grow. I don't even think HTS would want to see ISIS take any more territory, because they had a clear split. Even though they're both Islamic extremist groups, even though they came from the same root, they had a clear split. So they don't want to see ISIS taking hold either. But it's not quite clear what this will do to our what has been a very successful counter-ISIS program that we've had in place for literally the last almost a decade, but the last 9 years.
So as there is a big question mark about the future of Syria, how might this impact the United States? Obviously, the United States has a vested interest in what happens in Syria, as do a number of other countries. But how might this impact the international relations world?
Well, it's going to have a huge impact. First off, for the Iranians, this is a phenomenal loss. There's a thing called the Shiite Crescent. It's basically it's a swath, if you will, territory that runs up through Iran, through Iraq, across Syria, into southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah is. Well, with this, the big chunk of that crescent just got taken out, which is it's no longer there. The Syrian government, the Alawite government under Assad, was essentially a Shiite, part of the Shiite Crescent. And so Iranian influence, this Shiite Crescent concept, the axis of resistance, just lost a cornerstone of their entire program, if you will, or their entire presence in the Middle East. So that's going to be a huge hit for Iran. For Russia, this is a huge hit as well, because for them, this was how they got to the Middle East. This is a checkpoint of how they got forces into Africa. So that's going to be a huge part of what they're running into. And so that's a big problem. But this has dramatic implications for those countries. For the U.S., the issue is it's just south of our our NATO member, NATO ally, Turkey, and yes, the Turks are engaged with this, and the Turks are backing certain militia forces that are down there. So that's a big part of it. And then of course you got Israel, and then we have Jordan, which is a staunch U.S. ally in the region. Saudi Arabia, we got a forced presence in Iraq right next door. So we, with the exception of really, if you look at it, Lebanon, we have forces deployed all around Syria to some extent. Certainly not way up north in certain areas, but all around them. And so this is something we have to watch very closely. Right now, the what I understand, the Biden White House is saying we're standing back, we're observing, we're trying to figure out what's going on. President-elect Trump has said, "Look, this is not our war," and so he's saying he's pulling back. And you may recall that during his administration, he actually issued an order to pull our forces completely out of Syria at one point, and that's what triggered Secretary Mattis, the defense secretary, to actually resign, was because of that decision. This is a way of saying I don't know what our situation is going to be, because this is all unfolding so quickly. I mean, it literally just happened yesterday. Right now, we're just kind of saying, well, we're just observing the situation, but the reality is, over this week, we're going to try and get a better idea of who's who and who controls what. We're also going to have a better idea that now that they've secured Damascus, are they going to consolidate power, or is this thing going to break into a full-scale civil war like we saw a decade ago?
Hal, before we let you go, two questions pertaining to President Assad. He has now fled the country to an undisclosed location. What happens to him? And two, is there a possibility that he could try and reassume power?
Interesting you say that. Before he fled, there was actually a little push for him to go to another country and set up a government in exile, which I thought was kind of an odd thing. He's a dictator, and there's that famous saying that dictators always look good until about the last 10 minutes, and that was his situation, which is he's a dictator. Certainly a week and a half ago, nobody foresaw that this was going to happen. Pretty much everyone had said, "Hey, look, all the lines are frozen. The Iraq Civil War is really just kind of a moribund civil war. There's going to be no big change." And then you had this huge shift. So for him personally, I'm not sure what country he's in. That's not clear. There were reports that his family had gone to Russia earlier, and there's a lot of speculation that he may have gone to Russia. Although, with that said, he could have fled to Iran. There's not that many countries he can really flee to. That's one of the issues. So pretty much one of those two countries is the most likely possibility of where he would have fled. And he did not set up a government in exile. And the other thing is, it's too late to do that now. His government, his prime minister, and for the most part, his government has surrendered to HTS. So there's no exile government that they could possibly put in place at this point. They're on the ground, they're there, and there's nothing they can really do. Although it's not clear, but a lot of folks that were close to the Assad family, who are in close to the regime, were trying to flee as quickly as possible. And I might mention that when the Russians said they were pulling out, and then the Iranians said they were pulling out, it looks like that was probably the triggering mechanism where everybody in the government just looked at each other and said, "We're done." And that's why you didn't see any fierce resistance, and that's why you see this mass surrender. So I'm not quite sure where he is. It's really not clear, but I don't think there's going to be. There's no popular support. This is the thing with Assad. He controlled power through brutal means of repression. Well, he no longer has those means to do that. So there really isn't any group. Now, I should mention that up around the Alawite homeland area, near the Mediterranean coast, that little enclave north, between Lebanon and Turkey, along the coast, as near as I can see, there are government forces that do control that area, and that's his traditional, Alawite clan homeland. That's his base, if you will. So in bypassing going down that highway that takes them down into Damascus, there's this section over here that they have not cleared, that HTS didn't clear, that where they have a, yeah, that's where the Russian bases were and a lot of things. So those are still in government hands. Again, it's a very fluid situation. I'm not sure how long that's going to last, and I'm not sure if the Alawites themselves in that area suddenly form something that becomes akin to one of the other groups operating, like the Kurdish control groups or something like that. If they control their little area on the coast and try to maintain that, and if that's the case, again, that kind of leads towards thinking we're going to have a probably drift back into more of a civil war between various factions.
It is going to be very interesting to see. And Hal, I know you're going to be very closely following all of the developments, as we are too here at Live Now from Fox. We appreciate you joining us.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie.